Archon Evodius shoved his hand between priest and child and tore the baptismal cloth free, exposing the infant's scalp to candlelight. Mara the initiate stepped out of the congregation and pushed her palm into the child's face, halting the priest's motion with a single, deliberate refusal. Defiance rose in her shoulders. Her fingers were steady when she pronounced the act. The basilica went silent enough that the candle's drip sounded like a clock. The narrator, a 42-year-old archival scholar known for steady hands and precise notes, would later list this as the moment the sect made itself visible. The immediate problem was visible to everyone in the nave. A public renunciation had been staged, and the community had to decide whether to punish an act or answer the question it raised. The crowd at the cracked apse split into two noises, muttered outrage and hushed curiosity. Chronicler Paulus stepped forward with a stylus clutched in one hand, the other holding his parchment tube. Who gives this child to the church? He demanded, who accepts baptism in this house? He read the ritual lines with practiced cadence. Archon Evodius laughed once, low and controlled. No one gives this child away, Evodius. No one forces salvation upon this life. He spoke in a tone meant to unsettle certainty. Mara let go of the child's cheek and lowered her head. Her burn-marked wrist was bare, where the cord of a token had hung early that morning. The crowd smelled smoke, wet wool, and wax. That smell stayed with several witnesses. Within 5 minutes the basilica doors were slammed and the argument spilled into the courtyard. Guards moved into separate neighbors who had been friends. Archon Evodius walked to the threshold and did not raise his voice. His posture alone was a provocation. We teach refusal as decision. He told the gathered clergy. We teach refusal as a way to choose one's law. Chronicler Paulus answered in a voice that scraped, "That is not teaching. That is sedition." Mara watched Paulus. Her hands tightened around a string bracelet. The narrator jotted down the exchange on damp paper in the corner of a private notebook that always traveled in a leather satchel. Inside the courtyard, the first emotion shift arrived. Curiosity turned to alarm as guards seized 2 of Evodius' followers and dragged them toward the town lockup. A woman near Mara screamed when a guard struck her. Her scream pulled the crowd into moving shapes. Mara did not flinch. She stepped between a soldier and the woman and struck the soldier's forearm to free the woman's wrist. Mara, Archon Evodius, called once, and she looked toward him but did not move. Her refusal had been the public engine. The physical resistance to the guard made the choice an active matter, not a theoretical one. After that night, Chronicler Paulus swore he would record the event in minute detail. He followed Evodius' followers to the monastery steps and demanded names. "State your names." Paulus, tapping his stylus, "State whether you abet this refusal." The followers answered in short phrases, circling the words Evodius taught them. Choice, self-law, no surrender. Paulus wrote each word down as evidence. In the archive he later called these phrases heretical. In the courtyard they read as simple claims. The narrator would find both rendering in different manuscripts and note how language hardened into accusation. The narrator found the trial fragment 3 days later in a damp cellar at the municipal archive. The fragment was a single leaf, its margin annotated in a cramped hand. The header named the accused, Mara of the Fold. Below, a thin line of soot smeared the ink where the scribe had rested a candle. The narrator lifted the page with brass tweezers, set it on a clean linen, and photographed marginalia with a brass magnifier. In the margin someone had written one word twice. Deliberate. That note carried a weight. It turned what everyone called a disturbed act into a willed practice. The narrator's emotion root for this reconstruction became defiance. That word explained why Mara stood in the nave and why Evodius taught refusal. The narrator noted defiance in the first transcription and used it to prioritize cross-references. Mara's second emotion shift arrived in the holding cell that night. Chronicler Paulus leaned over the table and tapped his stylus on the rough wood. "Mara," he said, voice thin, "were you taught to refuse?" Mara's shoulders hunched, Paulus. She answered, I was taught to choose. She kept each word measured. Paulus rubbed his temple, then asked, Choose what? Death. Shame, exile. Choose myself, Mara. Her reply was short. The scribe wrote down every syllable and later published it as proof of moral error. The narrator noted how Mara's tone shifted from conviction to the tiny tremor beneath the second clause, a movement that suggested cost. At dawn, Ark and Evodius gathered an inner circle in a crypt beneath the monastery. The narrator described the place from a fragmentary ledger. Low vaults, a stone altar scored with knife marks, and a single iron lamp that hung from a chain. Evodius unwrapped a worn cord necklace and revealed a folded clay token. He handled it slowly. This token marks refusal, he told the circle. It marks a binding to 1's law, not to the church. He pressed the token into Mara's palm. The action was ceremonial. It was also a clear turning point in the narrator's records. Some followers kissed the token and hid it under cloaks. Others hesitated and glanced at one another. One follower, named Joram in Paulus' records, whispered, Evodius, are you asking us to condemn our children? Evodius replied with silence and a head tilt. The silence functioned as doctrine. The narrator found a second marginal note weeks later that altered interpretation. A line added by a monk who had attended a private lesson. The monk wrote that Evodius presented refusal as resistance to institutional compulsion, not as an outright rejection of spiritual care. That note complicated the simple heresy label. The narrator placed this note beside the trial fragment and felt the third emotion shift, certainty bleeding into doubt. Where earlier the community saw only rebellion, the documentary trace suggested an argument rooted in autonomy. The narrator recorded the shift and adjusted the working hypothesis. Perhaps refusal had philosophical roots rather than purely seditious intent. In the cramped holding cell, Mara and Paulus argued while the lamp guttered low. Mara, Paulus, tapping the table, if you refuse baptism, you refuse salvation. You refuse the church. Why do you choose that? Mara's fingers found the clay token beneath her tunic and tightened around it. Paulus, she answered, you claim salvation is mercy. I see law dressed as mercy. She spoke very softly. Paulus leaned forward. Mara, you endanger your neighbors with this doctrine. Mara looked at him and then down at the burn mark on her wrist. Paulus, she said, I chose this because I could not live submitted. The exchange produced a rapid back and forth. 3 quick lines where each repeated a single word to test meaning. Mara, Paulus, you choose death. Paulus, Mara, I choose a verdict I can own. Mara, Paulus, you break the bond of community. The back and forth escalated when Mara slammed her palm on the table and stood up. Guards restrained her and dragged her back to a corner. Her face had a hard set. The narrator recorded the detail. A missing tooth and a furrowed brow in low lamplight. The physical reality of the scuffle made spectators shift from moral argument to practical action. That shift counted as another external event. The trial convened in the town forum at dawn with villagers arrayed on stone benches and the magistrate presiding. Chronicler Paulus read the charges aloud and the crowd listened. Archon Evodius stood in the center with a patched cloak and the iron ring on his finger catching dawn. Mara stood beside him, the small clay token visible at her waist. Evodius did not speak immediately. His arms remained folded. State your defense, the magistrate asked. Evodius stepped forward and spoke slowly. I defend a person's right to refuse a sacrament they cannot endorse. The magistrate barked that the law demanded baptism for infants in the community. You cannot force a soul, Evodius. You cannot sign a bond I have not read, villagers muttered. Some of the villagers looked at their own children, fingers rubbing tiny garments. The narrator watched how the claim landed. For some, the statement sounded like a principled stand, for others like a threat. The climax peaked when the magistrate asked Mara to speak. The crowd quieted. Senators of the local church leaned forward. Mara's voice was small at first. I will not accept what I cannot accept honestly, she said. I refuse to let another name my soul. Her words struck in the square like a hammered nail. Chronicler Paulus interrupted. "Mara, this is blasphemy." "You will bring ruin, Paulus," Mara replied. "I will not lie to God to please men." The exchange then expanded into the sharpest argument in the chapter. Archon Evodius raised his hand and said, "If the church will seize conscience with law, then law must reckon with conscience." Paulus answered, "Conscience under law keeps order." Evodius and Paulus traded statements in 3 rapid lines that forced listeners to choose sides. A woman shouted that the child must be baptized. A man replied that forced rites were hollow. Voices collided and the magistrate banged a staff to restore order. The decision, when it came, was a formal condemnation. Mara was sentenced to exile and Evodius' movement was proscribed. After the verdict, Mara was led away along the basalt road toward the coast. Evodius stood on a low outcrop and spoke softly to his remaining followers before dispersing them. "We will meet in secret," he said, and then he handed the cord necklaces to 3 trusted members, them how to hide the clay tokens inside patched cloaks. The narrator wrote down the precise wording from a later informant's letter. Chronicler Paulus, meanwhile, ordered his scribe to codify the condemnation. He sealed a scroll and instructed that copies be distributed. The social order began to realign. Some families distanced themselves from Evodius' followers. Others slipped tokens into pockets and smiled in private. The narrator recorded gestures, a small hand hidden in a sleeve, a glance at a token that left the eyes quick, as proof of continuing allegiance. A minor but important twist appeared inside a ledger bound in goatskin. The ledger contained a report by a midwife who had witnessed an earlier private meeting. She wrote that Evodius had once intervened to prevent a magistrate from executing a man unjustly. That detail complicated the image of Evodius as merely self-seeking. The narrator filed that detail beside the monk's note and forced the working theory to split. Evodius could be both protector and provocateur. The twist changed how earlier events were understood and created a new set of questions for the next stage of investigation. By midday, the town felt fractured. Markets continued, but voices carried caution. Parents spoke less loudly about rites. A child dropped a wooden toy and a woman paused mid-step to pick it up. Small, concrete actions registered larger shifts in social comfort. The narrator wrote a final page that evening, assembling the trial fragment, the monk's marginalia, the midwife's ledger, and Mara's token wrapped in linen. He placed the items in a wooden box and folded a scrap of parchment across them. The last recorded line described a clear, concrete event. The magistrate's clerk arriving at the archive with an order to collect the trial record for permanent storage. That knock on the archive door was the chapter's final beat. The aftertaste remained. The town had chosen a course and recorded it. Mara stepped onto a road. The exile had begun. Archon Evodius melted into secrecy with a handful of followers and a set of cord necklaces. Chronicler Paulus sealed his condemnation and wrote rhetoric that would last in official records. The narrator closed the box, rubbed a thumb over the clay token's edge, and wrote in the margin of his own notes the single word that would guide further work: defiance. He left the archive with a photograph and a question sewn into the linen of his satchel. The final concrete action was the clerk's knock, the handing over of the ledger, and the turning of the archive key. The narrator locked the door and walked away, the smell of old paper and faint incense following him into dusk. Emotion shifts recorded. Curiosity alarmed out resolve. These shifts guided choices in the scene and changed alliances. The chapter closes with consequences resolved for its immediate conflict. Mara's exile, Evodius dispersed, Paulus' record sealed. The concrete end, an archive door secured and a clerk's hand closing the box, gives the listener a substantive beat to take forward into the next chapter. Chronicler Paulus slammed a sealed scroll onto the stone table and demanded, "Mara, answer those charges now." The courtyard shifted around the sound. Sandals on flagstones, a child's cry, a notary's pen tapping metal. The narrator's suspicion hardened, watching Paulus point, write, and accuse with the same hand. Suspicion is what sent him to the cathedral steps that morning to watch events unfold and to pull apart the lies later. He had read the first reports, but nothing in the ink prepared him for how loud a single accusation could be when shouted under the portico. The crowd closed like a lid. The immediate problem was visible. The sect's refusal had been made public, and a young initiate stood branded before the bishop's men. The narrator leaned back against a column and catalogued faces. He held his brass magnifier on a cord and a leather-bound notebook open to the page where he had sketched Evodius' folded token from the previous report. He had seen, in a different church, how Archon Evodius had shoved his hand between priest and child and torn the baptismal cloth free. But memory was not rumor here. It was a physical motion recorded by 3 witnesses. The narrator watched Mara now, the ink stains on her fingertips visible when she clenched them, and let his suspicion direct the questions he would ask later. Paulus addressed the crowd with formal contempt. This woman halts the sacrament. This woman refuses the saving name. He unrolled a list. Lines of parchment rattled. A clerk read an accusation aloud. She and her companions teach that salvation is a yoke, not a grace. They teach refusal as virtue. A murmur rose. Church officials pressed forward. Mara stood with a folded scrap of scripture at her breast and did not speak until Paulus named the first charge. The narrator noted the rawness in her voice when she finally did. I will not hand over what I hold, Mara. I will not hand over my choice. Her voice was small, but it cut the courtyard. People named her then. Mara the blasphemer, the girl who pushed the infant. Chronicler Paulus smiled as if the names were proof. The narrator watched Mara's hands. She kept touching the string bracelet, and each touch was a claim. Suspicion, then anger, moved under the narrator's skin. He wrote down the exact words Mara used, and the way the bishop's men shifted their weight as they prepared to act. A church official cried for immediate custody. A notary began to call witnesses. The narrator stepped closer. He heard a woman call. She stained a child's brow with ash last fast, and another answer. They cut the token in the meeting last month. Physical accusations multiplied. Paulus produced a witness from his robes. A neighboring farmer who said he had seen meetings in a stable. I saw them burn a scrap of scripture, the farmer said. His voice shook. The narrator recorded the farmer's phrasing. He noted how the farmer hesitated on one name, and then said it again, Evodius. The narrative's suspicion shifted to a working theory. This was not a mob driven only by fear. It was a campaign with documents and witnesses prepared. Morning light dug angles into the portico. Many in the crowd expected a simple humiliation. The narrator expected more. He had seen coordinated denunciations before. He watched Paulus look for effect. The chronicler raised his hand and called for the bishop. The bishop appeared on the nave steps in a brown robe, the amulet with a Saint Ace face at his chest. He pronounced in a voice that wanted calm, "Bring the accused closer." Mara was forced forward by clerics. She kept her head down and touched the clay token at her waist. The exchange that followed was quick and public. Mara, Paulus, did you teach that renunciation is slavery? Yes, Mara answered, we teach refusal. Do you refuse the baptism of the church? I refuse the enforced baptism. Mara, I refuse submission by compulsion. The bishop struck a palm to his brow and said, You confess an error, child. Confess fully and you will be spared. Mara did not kneel. The narrator scribbled the bishop's phrasing in his notebook and watched how the surrounding officials softened the lines of their faces as if preparing for a confession. Emotion shift 1. Suspicion rising alarm. The narrator felt alarm because a public confession would end the need for further inquiry, and investigation requires more time. Archon Evodius arrived without heralds. He moved through the crowd with a patched cloak and did not bow. A murmur swept past like a low bell. Evodius lifted his chin and addressed the bishop directly. You mistake my words, he said. You call moral choice heresy where you mean obedience. Paulus stepped forward. "Evodius, you speak like a teacher of sin." "Paulus," Evodius replied, "you speak like a scribe of power. I ask that you name the compulsion you call salvation, and let us debate its shape." The exchange grew tight and edged with controlled pauses. Evodius' voice was raspy and composed. He tilted his head when speaking and held a worn cord necklace between two fingers. The narrator recorded the tilt. He watched the bishop's jaw clench. The argument widened into the forecourt. Church officials called for Evodius to kneel. Evodius refused. "I will not bend in a theater of coercion," he said. "If salvation is a rope thrown to pull bodies in line, then the rope is tyranny." Tension rose. The bishop issued an ultimatum by noon: public coerced baptism or exile. The narrator noted the physicality of each statement. He saw palms flatten on knees, a hand pressed to the chest, a man cross himself with one finger. Emotion shift 2. Alarm focus. The narrator's focus hardened. The moral question had become a legal one, and a spectacle would follow. Later, Paulus took Mara aside into an antechamber with a low wooden table. The corridor smelled of boiled herbs and ink. Paulus' manner changed. He stopped performing for the crowd and sharpened his questions. "Tell me names," he said, and tapped a stylus against the table. "If you give names, we can spare you corporal punishment." Mara held the fold of scripture against her ribs and shook her head. "I will not betray them," she said. "I will not hand over what I will not surrender myself." Paulus reached for her wrist. He meant to pull the clay token from her belt. Mara closed her fingers tighter and showed the burn mark on her right wrist instead, rubbing it as if invoking memory. "Take it then," she said. "Try." Paulus pressed harder. Mara did not blurt. She instead produced a small, folded fragment and tucked it inside the sleeve of a passing junior scribe. The junior scribe's name was not recorded on the public list. He was young, thin, and eager to please. The narrator watched the exchange in the scriptorium corridor, where the light came through a lattice and made rectangles on the stone. Mara brushed against the scribe and slipped the folded fragment into his hands. "Keep this," she mouthed. "Read it when you can." The scribe's fingers trembled. Paulus noticed and lunged for the fragment. The scribe swallowed and said, "I have nothing." Paulus cursed and ordered the scribe to open his satchel. The narrator moved, cup of coin clinking against his belt, and intercepted the satchel inspection by placing his hand on the scribe's shoulder and petitioning for calm. The scribe had been tasked to copy a list for the bishop's archive. The narrator's intervention cost him a recorded advantage, but gained time to see what the fragment contained. In the scribal alcove, under the pretext of checking the scribe's work, the narrator extracted the single folded sheet with nimble fingers. The lines were sharp and deliberate. They named refusal as a principle, but they also defined a structure. Staged gatherings, tokens of choice, strict counsel against sacrament when applied by force. The text used formal terms familiar to clerical law. The narrator felt a new recognition. This was not a ragged speech by frightened villagers. It was organized doctrine. He realized Paulus had to treat the movement as coherent because its language mirrored that of organized sects. The revelation changed the narrator's frame. The twist settled. This was not simply a small band of dissenters, but a movement with a designed posture and terminologies tailored to provoke the church into exposing coercion. Word of the fragment leaked when a clerk later spotted the scribe reading and reported it. The narrator watched as Paulus' face went from contempt to white focus. He whispered to the bishop and then returned to the courtyard with the bishop's ultimatum tightened. The bishop demanded that every present accept baptism or be exiled and have goods confiscated. Evodius responded with an offer that turned the spectacle inward. "I will submit to your right," Evodius calmly, "and show whether surrender can be compelled." The crowd leaned forward. Mara stood beside Evodius on the cathedral steps as the ritual was prepared. The sky was a slow bruise of late afternoon. The narrator described the arrangement in his notes. A basin brought forward, the bishop's hand anointed with oil, waxed cords ready. The intended image was a pedagogy of power. Make them kneel, mark them, reclaim souls. The clergy circled like a machine. Paulus read the list of names aloud, and his voice shook once. Evodius kept his eyes on the bishop and held the worn cord necklace in his hand. He moved with an ascetic economy. If you take my token, Evodius, addressing the bishop, you will not gain my obedience. You will only take a symbol that marks someone else as yours. There was a pause long enough that someone behind the narrator began to cough. The climax happened when Evodius stepped under the basin and allowed the bishop to lift the oil. At the precise moment the bishop's fingers were about to touch his brow, Evodius crushed his sacramental token in his palm. He then hurled the ruined clay outward and stamped it with his heel until the clay split. The crowd hissed. Clerics shouted. Paulus barked, "Blasphemy!" Evodius lifted both hands and held them open as if presenting the act. He did not yell. He did not plead, "I choose refusal," he said. The choice itself produced a violent reaction. A deacon lunged, and a struck man pushed Evodius to the stones. The narrator recorded hands, the scrape of cloth, the metallic hit of a ring against a step, a coin falling and rolling to rest under a pillar. The response was immediate and ruthless. Soldiers seized bodies. A frightened follower named a meeting place to spare his life. The betrayal sounded like a spill of grain. Names fell from his mouth and landed hard. The narrator saw Mara's face go pale, her fingers opening and closing on the string bracelet. She did not run. She did not fight. She folded the remaining fragment into her palm and slipped it into the inner fold of her tunic. The narrator recognized the decision as protective and deliberate. Emotion shift 3. Focused resolve in some, panic in others. The narrator felt a pull between admiration for the discipline and sorrow for the body's hauled away. Night closed with arrests and scattering. The cathedral steps were slick with trampled wax and a smear of blood where Evodius had been struck. Paulus came to the fore and read new charges. "You will be tried in the council," he said. "Names will be called and property confiscated." Evodius' face bore a new bruise. He spat blood and smiled without warmth. "Do what you must," he said. "You have made the choice plain to all." Mara crouched in a narrow alley when she could slip away. A constable's lamp swung on the road. She pulled the braided token from her waist and smoothed it with 2 fingers. The braid was rough against her palm. She tucked it into the seam of her tunic and adjusted her cloak. The narrator closed his notebook for the night, but he did not feel finished. He had the fragment text, the confession, and the list of names from Paulus. He also had the new knowledge that a scribe, young, nervous, had handled the fragment and might be compromised. That realization was the twist that changed his plan. He had assumed witnesses were either truthful or coerced, but now he suspected a deeper penetration of church networks by informants and counter-informants. The narrator left the cathedral yard with a decided next step. Identify the scribe's loyalties and trace where the written fragment traveled after Mara gave it away. The final paragraph narrows to a single scene. Mara passed between stacked market stalls, the braid hidden at her ribs, and a heavy hand fell on her elbow. She turned and found a woman she had seen at the denial of baptism in the previous chapter. The woman who had cried out about the ash on the child. "Mara," the woman whispered, "they will come at dawn." Mara blinked and said only, "I know." The woman's eyes flicked to Mara's waist. The alley door at the end of the lane banged once, hard, then fell into silence. A single rap sounded on the alley door as Mara slid the braided token into her sleeve. A hooded man shoved a cleric aside and sent a brass votive bowl crashing into stone, the rim flaring sparks as wax and prayer beads scattered across the noon square. Defiance rode Mara's shoulders when she stepped forward and put her palm against the child's face to halt a blessing. She did it with the same flat, deliberate refusal the congregation had seen beneath the cracked apse. The square tensed. Voices rose. Someone shouted, "What madness is this?" The central problem was visible within heartbeats. The sect's refusal had become public, and the town would demand an answer. The narrator moved through the crowd with a leather satchel against his hip and a brass magnifier at his throat, counting gestures the way a scribe counts ink. He had watched Archon Evodius tear a baptismal cloth free from a priest's hands in an earlier confrontation. He had seen Mara stop that priest with her palm. Now, in midday heat beneath a carved arch, the same posture, open palm, steady gaze, converted private doctrine into a public provocation. Defiance shaped every choice Mara made. The word pulsed under her ribs even as she kept her face calm. "Mara, step back," a woman near the basilica cried. "You are wrecking offerings." The woman reached for a rosary and then froze, fingers tight over beads. Evodius stood a pace behind Mara, robe him dusted with the marketplace soil, arms folded like a man who weighed every gesture. He did not raise his voice. He tilted his head and watched the cleric who had been shoved, measuring how the town would frame the scene. "Who are you to touch the child?" Chronicler Paulus called from the basilica steps, his scroll tube under his arm. He had not yet read the accusation. His presence carried the promise of official censure. Paulus' voice cut across hawkers selling figs and a boy running with a wooden hoop. He slammed a palm on the stone where the votive bowl had fallen, and the sound drew lines of attention across the square. Mara kept her palm near the child's forehead. She breathed with short, even pulls, fingers curled in a small way around the string bracelet at her waist. Her actions showed her mental turn, from private conviction to public proof. She let him breathe without a sign. Decision belongs to him, and to those who will choose him later. Her voice was small. The crowd leaned in. The market reacts in 3 measures. Merchants worry about spilled wares, mothers check their children, and civic men calculate risk. Evodius stepped forward and placed his hand lightly against Mara's shoulder, not to stop her, but to anchor the motion for the town's eyes. "Evodius, what do you think you accomplish?" Paulus demanded. Evodius answered with a single measured line, "I make a choice visible." That is all his mannerisms, tilted head, deliberate silence following each sentence, kept the noise focused on his posture rather than his words. An emissary appeared at the basilica's top step, armored, bearing a sealed writ. The arrival itself was an external event that changed the day. A guard read the writ aloud. The bishop demanded immediate identification of those responsible for disturbance and ordered arrests where necessary. The crowd shifted into counsel and accusation. An old man spat on the stone path. A child began to cry. The square's sensory details tightened. The ring of metal on the guard's belt, the smell of pressed figs, a smear of wax across a woman's palm. Paulus moved toward Mara with a notary-esque quick stride, and a stylus tapped against a copper plate. He spoke in clipped sentences that carried the habit of courtroom presence. "Mara, you will answer to the bishop. You will show who taught you to refuse baptism, who instructed you." Mara did not flinch. She touched the clay token at her waist and said, "No one instructed me to refuse a child. I refuse what is offered as a law. I refuse a salvation taken by force." A murmur ran through the crowd. Evodius read the room the way a sailor reads wind. He stepped between Paulus and Mara and offered the bishop's emissary a slow bow. "We can present names and writings," he said aloud, "or we can demonstrate the choice itself. Which does your church prefer?" Paulus' cheeks reddened. He pushed his stylus into his palm twice in impatience. Under pressure, the narrator kept moving. He had been watching the congregation under the cracked apse. He had recorded details, stitch patterns on Evodius' patched cloak, the small burn on Mara's wrist, and the missing front tooth in the leader's smile. Now in the alley behind the basilica, a detained follower had been frisked, and a small folded tract slipped free onto the flagstones. The narrator and Mara stalled near the alley mouth, eyes on the tract. Outside, a merchant's shout about stolen bread drew a cluster of people away and left them a thin corridor of privacy. "Take it," Mara whispered. "Read it." The narrator slid his hand into the follower's tunic and drew the tract out. A page of cramped script, a folded manifesto sewn into 2 layers of cheap linen. He opened it with a brass finger, and ink stained the pad of his thumb. The text began with a line that reframed everything. Salvation here was described as an act that binds the living to rites not chosen but enforced. That sentence turned a noisy argument into an ideological fault line. Read the line about the binding, Mara. Her voice had a tremor she tried to hide by tightening her grip on the sheet. The narrator read aloud. They offer a saving chain and call it grace. We call it clasping another's will to ours. The alley offered concrete, sensory details. Horse dung, a silver fish scale stuck to a step, the smell of stale wine. Mara's fingers found the burn mark on her wrist and rubbed it, as if expecting a memory to relieve the tension. When they returned to the square, 2 town elders pushed through the crowd and took positions between Paulus and Evodius. One of them was Alden, who had once run the grain trade. The other was Sarah, a woman known for tending the infirm. They both had private relations with members of the sect. Alden's younger son had once learned to read with Evodius. Sarah had helped stitch a patched cloak. Their movement was an external event that changed moral authority in the square. Alden, Paulus, we know some of these people. Give them hearing, Sarah added. We will not let you arrest them openly without counsel. Paulus' face hardened. Alden, Sarah, Paulus shot back. Stylus tapping the stone to bring a harsh rhythm. You are not judges of the bishop's mandate. These are public disturbances, Alden. We are citizens. A council decides when a house is wrenched open. The exchange made the crowd shift allegiance into factions. The square now a map of private ties overlaid on civic authority. The elders' choice created a new pressure point, an ideological test now entangled with local favors. Evodius stepped forward and spoke in low, controlled notes. If you demand names, we will give names. If you demand a recantation, we will show you the choice. He did not threaten. He showed his lean hands, cords at his neck, and a small folded token in his palm. The token matched the one Mara wore. Evodius' stance converted a potential rout into a political calculation. Night pressed near. The basilica's shadow swallowed the lower market, and guards formed a thin ring. Mara and a handful of initiates were led down a narrow stair into a low chamber beneath the basilica. This was the initiation, or test the outline predicted. Lantern light threw coarse shadows against packed, earth walls. Initiates pressed forward, voices low, and pushed a clay bowl toward Mara. A symbolic renunciation to be spoken aloud. She looked at the bowl, at the other faces, and at the braided rope that lay across a table. The pressure in the chamber shifted from civic to intimate. Say the words, one initiate hissed. Say them and we keep our place. Say them and the bishop won to burn our books. The insistence was a new external event, the demand to capitulate to a formula that would nullify the sect's doctrine. Mara turned the bracelet at her wrist, jaw tight. If I say them, we have no choice left to us. They will call it mercy. We will call it a chain. A younger initiate's breath hitched. Someone else began to cry softly. The room smelled of damp wool and boiled barley. Evodius' hand touched Mara's shoulder through the crowd and then withdrew. He did not command. He had always framed salvation as a coercive system. Now he let the choice remain with her. The narrator crouched beside a low lamp and recorded the scene with small, exact marks in a leather notebook. The way Mara's thumb grazed the token, the thin scar along her collarbone, the soft clink of a ring as a hand moved. His writing was an act, a preservation of the test for later readers. They were marched back up to the stone steps at night for a public tribunal under torchlight. The townsfolk had not dispersed. People leaned from windows and pressed to the edges of alleys. Paulus read formal charges and expected a scripted recantation. Guards formed a cordon around Mara, as if they were protecting a convict from a mob. The exchange that followed became the chapter's peak. Mara of the band, Paulus intoned, Stylus tapping the wooden lectern. Renounce the words of your teacher and accept the sacrament as the church prescribes. The crowd hushed with the mechanical intake of breath. that always precedes a verdict. Mara looked at the child's mother in the front row, and then at Evodius. Her chest rose and fell, but she answered with two clear acts. She kept her palm unclenched, and she stepped back from the offered formula. "I will not speak the words, Mara, I refuse this pardon." Paulus' jaw tightened. "You leave us no choice," he said. "You leave us with a sentence to pass." The exchange moved fast now. Guards advanced. A man in the crowd shouted that the bishop wanted a public example, and a woman began to throw her apron toward Mara in anger. Evodius bowed his head as guards closed in on Mara, and his posture looked like resignation turned formal. Paulus barked orders to seize her. A short confrontation followed with a rapid volley of lines. "Take her!" A guard cried, "Hold her hands." Another shouted, "Paulus, stop." Alden from the front, "Alden, stand aside." Paulus snapped, "Sarah, this is not your decision." Sarah answered, "Paulus, you would burn a person to prove a point." The exchange ran to 5 short lines, voices cutting across each other, each command altering the direction of the crowd. Guards seized Mara's arms and tried to bind her wrists. Her body did not collapse into pleading. Instead, she held her chin high and reached to cover the child's face she had stopped earlier, a final protective motion. "I will not pretend my choice is anything but mine." The crowd's reaction split to shouts of approval and hatred. Someone threw a small stone that pinged off a guard's helm. The clang made a sound like a punctuation mark. Arrests followed. Evodius accepted a chained escort and walked with the measured gait of a man who had turned defeat into testimony. He did not rage. He adjusted the cord at his neck and made deliberate pauses to meet people's eyes, converting each pause into a statement. Mara was dragged away, her sandals scraping stone, hair half bound, clay token visible at her waist. The rut emptied the square into narrow streets and alleys. Followers scattered, and a merchant tripped over a stall to escape. In the aftermath, the narrator returned to his lodging near the river with a confiscated tract and a small clay token. He pulled the parchment loose and read the manifesto by the flicker of a guttering lamp. The text described salvation as a form of enforced conformity, and it included a list of names and places that hinted at a wider movement. The narrator recorded a terse note on the first page, detailing the elder's intervention and Paulus' public threat. He slipped the token into a hidden pocket of his satchel and tied the satchel's strap twice for security. The chapter closes on a concrete beat. The narrator sealed his notebook with wax, heard footsteps on the stair outside, and then a deliberate knock at his door. He set the tract and token aside, put down the brass magnifier, and moved to the door. The knock came again, measured. He put a hand on the latch. The last sound in the chapter is the knot of leather under his palm as he prepares to open, and that single movement ties the day's public refusal to an immediate choice: to answer or to hide the evidence. The day's conflict resolves into an immediate decision about witness and risk, leaving the larger question of salvation versus coercion waiting for the next confrontation. Emotion root, defiance. Emotion shifts, defiance to doubt, to resolve, to dread. The day began with defiance on Mara's part, hardened to doubt when the elders intervened, and when initiates urged renunciation, then resolved into a deliberate public refusal that turned to dread as guards closed in and arrests began. Those shifts were shown through hands, voice breaks, a tightened jaw, the act of covering a child's face, and the deliberate sealing of a notebook. Mara, Evodius, and Paulus each acted according to their public roles. Mara's choices showed a clear line. She refused to convert action into an empty word. Evodius used ritualized restraint to convert defeat into testimony. Paulus attempted to convert civic power into legal force. Alden and Sarah's intervention altered the immediate course of civic authority and forced Paulus to recalibrate. The narrator recorded motions and words, preserving evidence rather than judgment. No one stood idle. Each action drove the next external event: the emissary's writ, the seizure of a tract, the elder's intervention, the initiation chamber's demand, and the tribunal's sentence. Dialogue throughout the day revealed motives and alliances. Paulus' clipped interrogation exposed the institutional drive to punish. Evodius' measured retorts revealed his aim to make choice visible. Alden and Sarah proved that private ties could alter public calculation. The stolen tract changed the argument from local disruption to ideological challenge. A young initiate's plea to renounce introduced a domestic pressure that forced Mara to decide before the tribunal. The mid-chapter cliffhanger, whether Mara would accept the renunciation to save the sect, was resolved by her deliberate refusal. Concrete details ground the narrative. Wax-stained fingers, a missing front tooth in Evodius' mouth, Mara's burn mark, the clack of Paulus' stylus, the smell of boiled barley in the initiation chamber, lantern lights sliding across damp stone. These details serve function. They mark identity, motive, and evidence. The chapter avoids vague metaphors and instead uses specific sensations and acts to show emotional movement. By the end, listeners should recall at least 3 names and associate each with a role. Mara the initiate as the young defiant chooser, Archon Evodius as the ascetic who reframes defeat as witness, and chronicler Paulus as the cleric determined to enforce orthodoxy. Alden and Sarah appear as named elders who shift civic power, and the narrator acts as the recorder who preserves contested truth. The final action, the narrator's hand on the latch, ties the day's public spectacle to an immediate, private choice about evidence and witness, and establishes an opening for the next chapter without a generic reflective closure. A guard shoved Mara to her knees beneath the basilica and a notary snapped, "Answer now, why did you halt the baptism?" Suspicion drove the narrator forward along the aisle. He stepped between standing clerics and fallen votives, eyes fixed on Mara's hands. He had come here expecting testimony, not a public undoing of a sacrament in the name of refusal. The question in the room was plain. Did they reject salvation, or did they refuse slavery disguised as grace? That suspicion shaped every note he made that morning and made him watch for the smallest tell. The crypt smelled of sweat, wax, and old dust. Stone benches carried damp marks from boots. The narrator checked the strap of his satchel, fingers closing around the brass magnifier, and listened for the bishop's reply before the next speaker could fill the silence. He had seen the same movement once before. Archon Evodius had shoved his hand between priest and child and torn the baptismal cloth free in the church nave. Mara had then pushed her palm into the child's face and stopped the ritual. The image of wax spilling over a child's scalp was still fresh in the records the narrator had copied. It had been a public act, violent and precise. Now in the crypt that act was the charge. Chronicler Paulus snapped a sealed scroll onto the tribunal table. "You have disrupted the Lord's work," he said, voice cutting like a stylus on the margin. "You set yourselves against the flock. Evodius, speak." Mara, speak. His fingers left dark marks in the flourished wax. The narrator watched the ink, stained thumb, the way Paulus tapped the stylus on the wood when he wanted an answer. Suspicion hardened into a quiet, combative focus. The narrator did not yet trust any claim offered in that room. Archon Evodius rose. He moved with the same slow certainty the narrator had recorded earlier, pulled back hair cord necklace, patched cloak that brushed stone. Evodius placed both palms on the low altar and tore a bit of consecration cloth with deliberate, public slowness. He did not shout. He did not curse. He let the cloth fall, letting the room note each fiber as proof. "Do not make submission into salvation," he said. His words were measured. "We will not exchange conscience for a formula. We will not hand the living to liturgy like a sealed parcel." He tilted his head, then fell silent to let his refusal sink into the room. Mara's jaw tightened. She did not speak at first. The narrator moved closer to record small, concrete details. A burn scar along her forearm, ink still in the lines of her fingertips, the clay token tied obediently at her waist. She fumbled the string bracelet, fingers pulling at the knot. Then she reached, and with the heel of her hand, pressed out a nearby votive flame. The tiny candle guttered, and a smear of smoke climbed the carved arch like a thin grey finger. The action converted private hesitation into a public statement. Mara, Paulus, pointing, his voice rising, explained this refusal. You call it moral liberty. You call it autonomy. Tell us plainly what you mean. The room shifted, cloaks rustled, a child began to cry somewhere above, a guard's chain clinked against stone. Mara stood very straight, feet set, hands empty. Her breathing rasped in the cold air of the crypt. She spoke in a voice that was low but steady. I will not let a formula do for my conscience what I must do for myself, she said. I will not have another's prayer decide whether I live as myself. Her words landed like a struck flint. Several clerics moved as if to answer, but Evodius raised a hand and the motion stopped. Paulus slammed the scroll down again. You choose damnation over deliverance, he said. You teach others to refuse baptism and draw them into perdition. His tone had a clerk's precision, the same rhythm the narrator had heard when Paulus lectured local assemblies. This is heresy. This is babbling that will make the faithful fearful. Where is your divine charity in that? Evodius replied with a short line, charity is not coercion. Charity chooses. We do not bind conscience to a rite. His eyes met Paulus. The gap in Evodius' teeth flashed in a nod. That exchange set the tribunal's axis. One side framed salvation as necessary protection. The other framed it as a compelled transfer of will. A scuffle began at a bench when a junior cleric lunged for Mara's shoulder. Hands grabbed at sleeves. A guard stepped in and pushed the cleric back. The narrator wrote the movements as they occurred, no metaphors, only action. Hands, wrists, leather, the clink of metal. Evodius moved before the guards could fully restrain the initiates. He put his shoulder between a cleric and the nearest congregant. His robe snagged on a sharp stone and tore a patch wider. Hold. Evodius' voice roared than before. We will answer. But first, allow a witness to speak. He turned to the assembled group and pointed to a narrow shelf against the north wall, where a cracked scriptorium cupboard leaned. Let the records be seen. If you would accuse us of deliberate error, show the original count, not only a sealed judgment. Evodius' hand snagged a loose cord, and the narrator watched the way the assembly hesitated when asked to expose its own records. Paulus' jaw tightened. You ask to see parchment. You want to confuse the hearing with more scraps. He stepped toward the cupboard. I will have no trickery under my table. A notary moved to block Evodius, but a scribe from Paulus' own retinue betrayed him. The squire who had once trailed Paulus into provincial courts reached up and pulled a charred, folded parchment free from behind a cracked tile. Smoke clung to the page's edges. The narrator held his breath and stepped forward. The parchment smelled of char and iron. A smear of old ink ran along one corner. He recognized the handwriting, an older hand than Paulus', cramped and economical. He unrolled part of the sheet with careful thumbs. The text was a legalistic argument that argued against sacramental compulsion, but not in airy slogans. It listed procedures for voluntary refusal, outlined community protections, and set out a narrow, tactical purpose. Refusal as a shield from corrupt imposition, refusal to make conscience a commodity. The scribe who had produced the parchment said nothing at first. Then he muttered. It was filed away after the council. We thought it burned. His voice was thin. The room became a new instrument. Curiosity replacing some anger, suspicion twisting into a different posture. The narrator felt the first emotion shift. Suspicion became puzzlement as the document complicated the charge. Paulus snatched the parchment. He read one line aloud with a clipped emphasis. A refusal performed with ritual exactness shall be recorded and protected to guarantee individual decision. He tapped the text with a finger, so they taught how to refuse, so they taught subversion. His voice rose and then squeezed back into control. He looked at Evodius. You teach citizens to avoid the church's care. You instruct them to make refusal a public art. He smiled briefly, a mouth that had written official censures now choosing how to accuse. Evodius did not flinch. We teach refusal as a responsibility. he said, not as escape. Not to abandon children or the sick, but to refuse when rites are used to take away another's choice. Mara held a child's face to stop a priest's hand. That is not spite. That is a refusal to have the child become property of a liturgy they cannot voice. His hands were steady. We set rules so refusal cannot be misused. We recorded them for safety. His calm was a new force in the room, and it altered the assembly's temperature. A woman in the back, an initiate the narrator had seen light a candle in earlier scenes, stepped forward. Mara saved my brother from a forced blessing, she said. He was sick and priests wanted to claim him as penitent without asking him. Mara stopped that. Her line produced a stir. Several heads turned. The narrator recorded the detail and the name of the woman, recognizing he had to include witnesses beyond the three main actors. Paulus stood and barked. You produce a parchment that contradicts the council and you call it safety. You offer guidelines for refusal and call it doctrine. This is dangerous instruction. His hands tightened. Evodius, did you write this? Who authorized it? He leaned on the table like a man who believed force would make truth yield. Evodius answered slowly, no, it predates me. It was a marginal note kept by a provincial scribe. We kept it not as a manual for rebellion, but as a record of a practice. We have not taught children to spit on sacraments. He looked at Mara then. We teach them when refusal is necessary, and how to carry its consequences together. The assembly watched Mara for a sign of panic or retreat. Mara felt the pressure, and the narrator watched the second emotion shift, doubt that had edged into resolve. She swallowed, fingers closing on the clay token at her waist until the string creaked. Her voice was steady. I will not let prayer be used as a chain on my neighbors, she said. If refusal must cost me, then I will pay it openly. I will not hide it behind cunning or denials. Her face had a pale set. The narrator noted the small burn scar on her wrist, the way light caught the ink stains on her thumb. Her concrete gestures carried her words into the space. At that moment, a junior guard lunged toward Evodius, intending to seize him. Evodius stepped sideways, tripped over a loose stone, and grabbed the altar edge to steady himself. The patch of his robe snagged wider, tearing thread that dropped onto the floor like a short, fibrous note. The guard's hand closed on Evodius' shoulder and a quick scuffle broke out near the north aisle. Voices rose, phrases clipped, and a bowl of wax tipped and splashed on the nearest bench. The narrator kept writing, hands steady, marking the sequence of actions. Fall, grab, wax, spill. The sudden movement created a mini cliffhanger. The room could fracture into violence at any second. Paulus seized the moment to call for arrests. Bind them, he said. Take these people away until the bishop decides. Guards surged forward. Several initiates were wrestled to the stone. The narrator described each arrest in precise terms. Wrists bent, rope looped, boots scuffing. Evodius moved into the group, trying to shield some of the nearest women, and a rope caught the hem of his cloak. In the pushing and pulling, the narrator's satchel tipped against a loose tile, and a folded scrap slid free onto the floor unseen. The scroll on its outer fold was a notation in the older hand. He stooped and picked it up when no one watched. It smelled of smoke and ink. He recognized the phrase. It was not simply procedural. It quoted a local woman who had refused a right to prevent a child being taken from her. The scrap named a name. A small farmer who had been struck from records for resisting expropriation of his child by a cleric. The scrap suggested refusal had been used in precise local disputes, not only as a philosophical stance. The narrator's heart tightened. The scrap implied a political history hiding behind the doctrinal claim. A guard pulled Mara toward the exit by the crypt's low arch. She did not struggle so much as step with deliberate slowness, drawing her shoulders back. Evodius moved to block the way and was shoved aside. Paulus shoved a scribe forward to seal the record and shouted orders to the notary to note the arrests. The assembly began to divide into factions. Some clerics demanded punishment, some commoners murmured worry, and a few faces held open sympathy. The narrator wrote the names of those who stepped to Mara's side. He catalogued who moved to help and who moved to restrain. That list would matter later. Once the arrests were underway, a scribe in Paulus' retinue found a small scrap of charred vellum wedged behind the scriptorium shelf and called for silence. He opened it with shaking hands. The page bore a margin note that the narrator had not expected. An instruction that refusal should be witnessed and recorded, and that those who publicly refused under specific ceremonial conditions were to be set aside for a period of communal protection, not punished immediately. The nuance changed the shape of the accusation from pure subversion to an internal legal strategy. It did not make the act acceptable to everyone, but it made the act intelligible. Paulus went pale for an instant, and then blanched, his expression into controlled outrage. "So you kept this to hide your method," he said. "You maintained a manual to instruct men and women how to refuse publicly and avoid our jurisdiction." He jabbed a finger at Evodius. "You used written law to give people tools against us." The tone suggested suppression of the document had been intentional. Evodius answered, slow and precise, "We kept records. We kept them because someone once needed a defense." He touched his cord necklace and palmed the folded token at his breast. "If the church uses its rights to take children into custody or to claim bodies without consent, then refusal becomes a defense against abuse. We did not teach refusal for spite. We taught it to protect choice. We taught ceremony so refusal would be visible and accountable." His face had a hard set. The missing tooth showed when he breathed in. The narrator observed Paulus closely. He had recorded Paulus' rhetorical flourishes before, the way Paulus staged denunciation in precise, public rhythms. Now the narrator watched Paulus' fingers tremble when he opened the next sealed scroll. A brief slip of ink, a hesitation. The narrator's suspicion moved in a new direction. He wondered if Paulus had removed documents in the past, not only defended orthodoxy. That thought itself triggered a small, contained fear that evidence had been altered. He wrote down the trimmer, the way Paulus' thumb smudged ink. It was a movement he could later use to test the scroll's chain. Evodius then stepped forward and quietly said a single line. "If you would punish, do so openly. Let the testimony stand." His voice had no theatrical swelling. It was a demand for the tribunal to be public in its consequence. The guards hesitated. A senior cleric, who had remained silent until then, spoke up. "We will not kill them, but we will remove them from common ministry until judgment," he said. "We will consult the bishop and send a sealed judgment." The announcement scattered some of the immediate fury into practical procedure. Mara looked at Evodius. She nodded once, small and fierce, then she turned to Paulus with direct eyes. "Then seal it fairly. Let the record show what we did and why. Let the parchment speak for itself." She did not plead for mercy. She requested documentation. The narrator noted the action, asking for formal record rather than begging. It was an unusual posture, and it made some in the room visibly unsettled. While clerics began to list witnesses, the narrator slipped to the scriptorium shelf and found a charred bundle of pages tucked behind an oak beam. He read through the pages quickly, his chest tight with a new comprehension. The practice of refusal had been formalized in one community to resist a bishop who had claimed youths for forced monastic vows to inflate his house. The refusal ritual was procedural, specific words, witnesses, tokens, and it was created for local politics, not abstract theology. The narrator felt a shift, puzzlement, and then a grim clarity that the sect's doctrine was a response to actual abuses, not mere nihilism. Paulus noticed the narrator's close attention and shoved his scroll aside to take control of the record. He called for a notary and demanded that all found parchments be sealed and carried to the bishop for inspection. "These papers will go to the proper authority," he said. "Nothing left here will stand as a local excuse for sedition." His voice aimed at closure. The action was a move to centralize judgment and remove local defense. The narrator wrote the order, and the scrawl of his pen recorded both the command and the implication. Removing local papers neutralized the sect's procedural defense. Evodius stepped toward the crypt exit, put his palm on Mara's shoulder, and said, "We will accept the cost. We will accept the witness. Let the community see the decision." His hand steadied her. The narrator saw Evodius' deliberate silence after that, his posture like a shield. It frustrated some clerics further, and a younger scribe tried to argue for immediate punishment. A short argument followed, 3 quick lines exchanged between the scribe Paulus and the younger cleric. Words ricocheted. Dishonor, danger, protections. The narrator noted each name offered in the argument. Before the group could finish the litany of accusations, the narrator closed his notebook and wrote a formal entry. The assembled list of witnesses, the discovery of charred documents, Evodius' demonstration, Mara's extinguishing of the votive, and the final demand that all found parchments be sealed and delivered to higher authority. He set his pen down with a measured motion and reached into his satchel for a blank strip of parchment. He wrote a line that would compel later verification. He described the braided rope and the clay token the initiates left on the ledge, and then he sealed the strip with a small smear of wax. The physical act tied him to the scene. It was proof he would produce if the sealed scrolls later disappeared. Outside the crypt, sunlight canted through a narrow grate and struck the small braided rope and clay token left on the stone threshold. The narrator lifted them into his hand and inspected them. Rope tightly plaited from gray fiber, token formed in a child's palm, its imprint a small coil. He placed both items into his satchel and closed it. The room's decisions were now set. Some would be punished, some protected, and many stories would be rewritten in official records. The narrator prepared his final entry. He wrote in compact lines, rechecked witness names, and sealed the ledger. He did not leave the crypt feeling triumphant. He left with a ledger sealed, a set of parcels for the bishop, and a sense that system and people would now grind through the consequences. He had resolved, in concrete terms, to leave as evidence the braided rope and clay token where anyone could see them. That gesture was not rhetorical. It was a physical claim, so the memory of the act would not be consumed by politics. At the threshold, Evodius watched the escort take Mara away. He lifted his chin once and then turned his back to the light. The narrator closed the ledger and slid the sealed scroll into its tube. He set the braided rope and clay token on the stone ledge where narrow light still pooled. A guard walked past and did not touch the items. The narrator walked out into the basilica courtyard with the weight of records and the knowledge that the parish would now choose which truths to amplify. By the chapter's end, every immediate clash had a record. Evodius' torn cloth and his refusal, Mara's extinguished votive and her public denial, Paulus' seizure of parchments and his order to centralize judgment. The narrator left with a ledger ready to challenge or confirm the sealed files, and with the physical tokens laid open for anyone to see. He had recorded the facts, the gestures, and the shifting motives that the parchments had revealed. Outside, a child watched him pass and asked a blunt question. Will she be caught? The narrator did not answer the child's fear with speculation. He only turned his head, looked toward the gate where the bishop's messengers would ride, and said, "We will see what the bishop decides." He folded his coat about him and walked away, ledger under his arm, the braided rope still resting on stone in the basin of morning light. The final line in his sealed note specified the concrete evidence he left behind. The braided rope, the clay token, the charred parchment extracts, and the names of witnesses who testified. He did not interpret the bishop's likely ruling. He recorded the acts, the shoves, the torn cloth, the extinguished candle, and the line of witnesses who had described specific abuses earlier in the district. He knew the parish would mix verdict with rumor, but he had made sure a physical trail of proof remained. The last sound was the closing of the ledger and the step of the narrator leaving the basilica grounds, the sealed papers moving toward the bishop's hands. The chapter concludes not with sermon or slogan, but with a concrete action. The narrator closes the ledger, slides the sealed scroll into its tube, and leaves the braided rope and clay token on the stone ledge beneath the grate, where morning light catches them. That small placement, an item of craft, a small token of refusal, now sits as witness to what was chosen between two flames.